Okay. Hello, everyone. Ala Esther Levy here, and welcome to the EIEQ Institute, a platform dedicated to the awareness, education, and practice of emotional intelligence. And today, on this episode of Recognize and Manage Your Level of Crazy with EQ, we're going to be talking about the psyche of evil. And the mental, emotional, and psychological reasoning for evil in our world and why we fall prey to it. But before we get there, I want to introduce our guest for today, Francisco Gil-White. And I am just so honored, first of all, so honored and so excited that you're here. And let me introduce this gentleman to you. And I saw him, just FYI, I saw Francisco on an amazing podcast called Through Conversations, and it blew my mind. And so I wanted to get in touch with him, and here he is in person. So thank you so much for giving us your time.
To the contrary, thank you for inviting me.
So Francisco Gil-White is an anthropologist, historian, journalist, political scientist. He holds an MA in social sciences and a PhD in evolutionary anthropology. It's a mouthful. He has taught at UPENN and at ITAM in Mexico City and at UMA, Valle de Bravo, Mexico.
So that's UMA.
UMA, yeah. Thank you. And Francisco is the creator of the newsletter and online course called Management of Reality.
Well, it's the title of the website, Management of Reality.
Of the website, thank you. And so with all that, he's an extraordinary human being, and I barely know him, but I can just feel the vibe already. And amazingly, we both had the inkling to wear white when we're speaking about darkness. So we are on the same page already.
I think mine is a very, very light blue, actually, or but it's almost white. Yeah.
Awesome. And on top of that, we have the Valentine's Day theme behind us because it's the month of February and we like to decorate for every holiday. So it's very interesting how all of this came together. Here we are talking about darkness and hate and all these things, but we're bringing in love and light, and we're going to flip this upside down and hopefully affect the rest of the universe in this conversation. And maybe we'll change some things. Who knows?
I love that kind of ambition.
Right?
That's fantastic.
All right. So let's begin, shall we? So my very first question when I saw you, I just had to know, as an anthropologist and as a historian, what has been your most remarkable adventure?
The most remarkable adventure, I think, without a doubt, has been my encounter with the Jewish people.
Okay.
Of course, I knew about Jews growing up, didn't have much contact with them. But after I became interested in studying racism, not anti-Semitism specifically, but just racism in general, I became an anthropologist to study that. And I completed my Ph.D. thesis on that topic. Produced a new theory to try to explain the evolutionary origins of the cognitive mechanisms that make us vulnerable to racist ideologies. And but as I said, that's general. It's not about anti-Semitism in particular. But then, on the strength of my PhD thesis, I was offered a job at the University of Pennsylvania. And once there, I started getting very interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict because that was one of the main themes of the think tank into which I was hired. So I was offered a job at the psychology department, but also I was offered a fellowship at this think tank that was called the Solomon Asch Center for Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict. And one of the main, and that was a joint project of the psychology and political science departments. And one of the main themes there was the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I started getting very interested in that. And as I did, and as I started studying the history of Zionism on the one hand, and the history of the Arab-Palestinian movement on the other hand, I increasingly was puzzled to try to, it seemed incoherent that there would be so much animosity against the Jewish people, because the more I studied the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the more I concluded that the Jewish nationalist movement, which is to say Zionism, was the most ethical nationalist movement that I had ever seen. And everybody was accusing them of colonialism and this and that, and imperialism. But when I started reading on the history of Zionism, what I found was that there was no evidence that the Zionists had ever taken land by force, which is what colonialists and imperialists do. The historical record is very clear. What the Zionists did is they bought land from Arab landowners who were freely willing to sell. And in fact, they paid very high prices for the land, which benefited the Arab landowners tremendously because nobody else wanted that land. It was unproductive land for the most part, swamp and desert and marginal agricultural land. So the question in my mind became, and also it's also true that the not just the landowners, but the laborers, the agricultural laborers who before the Zionists came had been slaves of the feudal landlords, the Arab feudal landlords. Those people, called felahin, I think is the proper pronunciation, those laborers were actually freed by the Zionists, because before the Zionists arrived, they were debt slaves to the feudal lords, and they couldn't really do much with their lives, and they were really, frankly, quite oppressed. But when the Zionists came and bought the land, some of the land, the people who worked those lands were freed, and then they were free to also take jobs in the kibbutzim and in the new industries that the Zionists were creating in Mandate Palestine. And so their lives improved tremendously. Mm-hmm. So the question in my mind became, what is it that people object to? Why is there so much hatred against the Jewish people? And that question then became a bit of an obsession because it was just so interesting scientifically. Mm-hmm. And so I started studying more and more history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then I became obsessed with understanding World War II. I mean, why would anybody want to kill all of these people in Europe? What were they doing wrong? Nothing. They were just living their lives and becoming excellent professionals and business people and journalists and artists and everything. They weren't hurting anybody. So that became the next question. And so I kept digging further back and back and back until I ended up studying the entire history of the West and the relationship of the West to the Jewish people and the impact of the Jewish people on the political evolution of the West. And that has been my greatest adventure, because studying this topic has allowed me to produce a model of how Western civilization works for the last, 25 centuries. And recently I have dug even deeper, and I have discovered that there is a pattern that is very consistent and very coherent in the political evolution, not just of the West, but all of Western Asia, which includes Europe. And now, of course, its descendant societies. And that's what I'm talking about now. So I'm talking a lot about this remarkably coherent and consistent pattern in the political evolution of Western Asia in a period going back 4,300 years to the revolution of Sargon of Akkad. So this has been my biggest adventure.
That's amazing. And when you talk about patterns, you know, and obviously this channel is all about emotional intelligence. This channel is all about how do we manage the crazy, right? And I call it, you know, I like to say, how do you go from bad crazy, or as I have coined it, reactive crazy to proactive crazy, right? The good crazy.
So we're all crazy in the end, but we want to be good crazy.
Exactly. So, and the gist of that is, okay, so why do we do these crazy things, right? Why do we hang out in the bad crazy, right? Because we know.
So what's the bad crazy?
The bad crazy is all that stuff like sadness, depression, jealousy, anger, frustration, you know, all the behaviors that just keep us stuck, right? Versus the proactive, which is happiness, joy, creativity, being productive with your time, all that type of stuff, right? So as you're talking about, you know, here's a nation that wants to kill another nation, and here we're talking about the psyche of these evildoers, right? Because we know, based on that video that you did with Alex, is that you know, there was a few different people involved in this process of wanting to eliminate the Jews, right? So why, you know, why out of, first of all, you mentioned it, that's fascinating. Why the Jews, right? And the first thing that comes to my mind, just from a basic human element, is jealousy, right? Could it be jealousy? A very basic emotion, right? Very primal, you know? Do you think it has something to do with that? You know, just being jealous of a race, of a person, of a society, just living their lives, trying to do the best they can for themselves, for their families. What do you think about that?
I don't think it helps us explain the entire history of anti-Semitism. I think it may be a contributing factor so that people who are already anti-Semites can find their anti-Semitism fueled or strengthened by envy and jealousy. But I don't think it's the root cause of anti-Semitism. So my explanation of the root cause is that we live in a world where some people, and you would call them evil people, I think I would too, enjoy power so much that they need to oppress others to feel good about themselves. And so they become criminal ruling elites, criminal power elites that try to take control of governments and other structures so that they can squeeze others and make themselves not only wealthy but truly powerful, right? To have control over other people's lives. And at many different points in history, people like that have become the government and have visited tremendous suffering on ordinary people. And Judaism is the movement that from the very beginning has fought against oppression. Now, people have trouble noticing this because they don't realize what they're reading when they read the Bible. If you look carefully at the context, at the political context of the origin of Jewish law, which is narrated in the book of Exodus, right? So the Jewish tradition says the Jewish law was born in a slave revolt, right? So the Israelites were the slaves of the Egyptian king, Pharaoh, and a revolutionary leader appears, who's Moses, and assisted by God, according to the story, God and Moses organize a series of events so that the slaves can escape to freedom, to the Sinai desert. And once those Israelite slaves are in freedom, then they get a new law. Well, what is this new law? It's the law of the escaped slaves. It's a law designed so that these slaves who had been oppressed by the Egyptian king can now live in a utopian society where nobody oppresses anybody else. Okay. Well, what I've recently discovered as I've gone deeper and deeper into the history of Mesopotamia, I find that this Jewish movement is in fact the last great and most sophisticated and mature and exquisite expression of a much older movement that was fighting oppression from 4,300 years ago, starting with the revolution of Sargon of Akkad, who founded the Akkadian Empire and established the ideology that the job of a king is to protect ordinary people. And therefore, kings, the ancient Mesopotamian kings, understood their role as that of creating legal reforms that would protect, the poor and widows and orphans and foreigners, etc., within Babylonian society, because that's what a king does. This is the ideology that the revolutionary ideology that Sargon of Akkad instituted, and it was very influential and in fact very stable for about 2,000 years. And this tradition, which I call Semitism, because it was created by Semitic peoples and then preserved and developed by Semitic peoples mostly, it established a political culture that I lost my train of thought. What I wanted to tell you, I think, is that so the Jews come at the anti-Semites, the counterpart of the so you have Semitism, what I'm calling Semitism, and then you have the opposing force, which is anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism managed to begin destroying this legacy of what would you call it, of progressivism, you might, in the original sense of moving towards, more extending rights to more and more people and giving them political participation, abolishing slavery, all of this stuff. That tradition, which lasted for about 2,000 years after Sargon, began to be destroyed when the anti-Semites, the opposing movement, started winning wars against the ancient Babylonian societies. And the biggest blow was perhaps Alexander of Macedon, who is called the Great in Western schools. And we are taught to admire Alexander. And what people don't understand, because they teach them very little about ancient Babylonia, is that what Alexander destroyed was this giant world of peace and brotherhood that was being protected at the time by the Persian kings, who had created a giant empire that was based on the ideology of Mesopotamian Babylonian Semitism and fused or combined with Zoroastrianism, which is another important ethical movement of antiquity, this one coming from the Iranians, right? So the Persian Empire was a vast collection of Semitic and Iranian peoples, all of them living together in brotherhood, even though they had many different traditions and religions and customs and so forth. And in this world of peace that lasted about 200 years, that's what Alexander of Macedon destroyed. So those are the people I call the anti-Semites, because they're opposed to Semitism and they're drunk with power and with the need to oppress others. What Alexander was doing was creating slaves. So he destroyed the empire that was abolishing slavery and brought war and slavery to that world. But in the 200 years that the Persian Empire lasted, the Jewish movement grew tremendously under protection of the Persian kings, and spilled out. The Jews spilled out of the Persian Empire and started settling in the Mediterranean, and they started influencing the Greco-Roman world, teaching the Greco-Romans, who were these war-crazy, oppressive ruling elites, making slaves of everyone around them. The Jews began teaching them to love their neighbor instead of loving war and loving slavery. And over the course of 25 centuries or so, Jewish influence and the Jewish example transformed Western societies, and we ended up producing in the West the best societies that the world has ever seen.
That's incredible. And I just wanted to mention one thing, that this video is raw and real. So if you hear noise in the background, we are here at our office. So please don't pay attention to it. There's no editing going on here. This is a real, straight up, conversation. So that's amazing. And that's really, it's almost like, how do I say, it's predictable that there would be people in the world that want to destroy that. And at the same time, it's truly frustrating, right?
Sure.
So tell me, where do you think, and I don't know if you're a God man, if you're not a God man, but you said nothing's off the table. So where do you see God in all this? How do you, where can we put spirituality? Because I know for me, spirituality is a huge component of growing our emotional intelligence, our intuition, our connection to spirit, how it moves us. Some people, don't have to be a believer, and that's fine too. And there's a lot of people that don't believe in God, but just know that they have to do the right thing, right? And so tell me maybe a better question would be, what is the pattern that you've seen? Because you talked about patterns. What is the pattern that you've seen with these evildoers? What is their level of godhood, I guess, if you could share?
Well, I mean, I don't think I can give you a very, very clear picture of what they believe, because there's a lot of secrecy going on at the top of our society. So it's hard to know what they really believe. But I would say that, unfortunately, spirituality is not it's not as it's just not it's not easy. Yes. As many people believe that you need spirituality to counter evil, but the answer is not as easy as that. Because you can recruit spirituality to do evil, and in fact, many people who do evil have a transcendent spiritual outlook that makes their life meaningful. Unfortunately, evil can be meaningful. So, for example, radical Muslims, they believe in God. They have a transcendent view of their role in the world, but what they want to do is perfectly evil, right? So the way they look at the world is, Muhammad heard the voice of God in his head, and God told him that those who don't believe that he heard the voice of God in his head should be killed. So you threaten people with death so that they will convert to Islam, and if they won't obey, if they won't submit, then you kill them. And for them, that's transcendent, because they believe it's good to bring everybody into what they think is the true faith. But what they end up doing with that transcendent story that fills their life with meaning is hurt other people, right? So spirituality is not obviously the answer. I mean, it's the right kind of spirituality that might help us, but not spirituality by itself. So what we need to understand is, what is it that causes these movements that channel spirituality into evil directions? And in the case of Islam, it's pretty clear that Islam grew through war, right? So Islam grew by conquering other societies by the sword and forcing them to submit to Islam, or else face extermination. And then, once you achieve that and the next generation grows up in Islam, well, they're being taught from an early age to derive meaning from, I guess I would say, from being right? Because this is what they teach Muslims, is to be proud of the fact that they have the correct religion, and that they're not infidels. They're not these inferior human beings who have the quote unquote wrong ideas in their head. And they're also raised to think that God will smile on them if they visit violence on the people who don't agree with them. They think they will be rewarded by that, by God, because to them this is a pious mission. And so unfortunately, this is a cultural religious system that teaches people to derive meaning from hurting other people.
And how come we fall prey to it? Like, we are very intelligent people, right? You see the world, we see a lot of patients here, super intelligent people, very, very rational minded. So what causes us to buy into these narratives, into these, you see what goes on college campuses. We see what's going on in the world where people are like supporting these movements that we know are dark and evil and dangerous. And they're so far from what you were talking about. You called it Semitism,
Yes.
right? So far from Semitism, completely the other way. So the question here is, why, as common people, do we fall to it?
Well, I think the fundamental problem is the principle of authority. And this is why Semitism is so important. So this is why the Jewish movement is so profound. The first commandment is the commandment against idolatry, right? So the most literal interpretation of the commandment against idolatry says that you are forbidden from constructing little idols to represent God or a God, and doing sacrifices to those idols and treating them as if they have powers. That's the most literal reading, and of course I think that's a valid reading of the first commandment. What the first commandment, but more profoundly, what the first commandment is trying to do is transform what was the pagan relationship to the deity to a completely different relationship. So in the pagan relationship, in the non-monotheistic relationship, what people would do is they would construct these little figurines that represented the gods they believe existed, and they would try to please those idols by doing a human sacrifice or bringing some kind of offering or whatever. They try to please the idols in order to manipulate the god, right? So, and there's an intermediary, which is the priest, who's supposed to be, in charge of the god. And if you do what the priest says, then the priest will help you to manipulate the god so that the god will use his or her powers to benefit you or to hurt your enemies or whatever. So it's a manipulative relationship. The relationship that Judaism teaches is one where the only way to please God is to love your neighbor as yourself. So that's Leviticus 19:18, right? There's nothing else you can do to please God. And that's a completely different relationship, right? So, but think about what it means that you're no longer when you're no longer trying to either appease or propitiate the deity, you are freeing yourself from the power of the priest who mediates that relationship. And what that means is that you're no longer under the authority of that priest, okay? You're only under the authority of your own consciousness, because your own consciousness is the only place where you can actually decide what is right and what is wrong. So the first commandment, the commandment against idolatry, is actually a commandment to take seriously that there is no authority that can tell you what is right and what is wrong. And there are several passages in the Bible, in the Torah, that are very consistent with this message. So, for example, there's the passage where at the very beginning of the story in Genesis, where God is thinking about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. And the character God in the Torah says, well, I don't know if I'm going to tell Abraham about this. I don't know. Should I tell him? I don't know. And in the immediately following scene, you learn why God is debating with himself whether or not to tell Abraham, because the minute Abraham learns that God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, the words just escape from his lips. He says, "You can't do that." He tells the Creator, "You can't do that." And he's upset. Abraham is very upset. And then he calms down because he realizes what he's doing. He's like, "Oh my God, I'm telling God off. Can I do that?" And he immediately starts, sort of apologizing. He says, "I'm a worm and I'm dust of the earth, and you're the Creator." Blah blah blah. But allow me to suggest, that perhaps this is not the right thing to do, and the God of the law should not be breaking the law. You're going to exterminate people. How could that be? How could that be moral? What if there are 50 regular, loving people in Sodom and Gomorrah? Are you still going to destroy the cities if there's 50 just people in it? And God doesn't reply, "You worm, I'm the creator of the universe. Who do you think you are, questioning me?" He doesn't do any of that. He respects Abraham as a person with consciousness capable of reasoning about what is right and what is wrong. And he grants the argument that Abraham is putting forth. He says, "You're right. If there were 50 just people in Sodom and Gomorrah, I would not destroy the cities." And as if he was in the market, negotiating with God, Abraham starts dialing it down. He says, "Well, what if there were 40? Would it be okay then?" And then God says, No. It would still be wrong. "Well, what if there were 30? He keeps trying to find where God's moral compass is. And it's very interesting because the guy who is really clear about what is right and wrong is Abraham. Now, what is that telling you? That is telling you, in my opinion, the Bible is communicating the message that you are responsible for what is right and wrong. You can't pass that on to some other authority. Because if you do that, you're violating the very first commandment, the commandment against idolatry. You see? So you are individually responsible for figuring out what is right and what is wrong. You can't pass that off to another authority, even if that authority is God. And that's what that passage is teaching us, right? So if you hear the voice of God in your head, or you think you hear the voice of God in your head, and it tells you to do something terrible, to go kill someone, for example, that doesn't make it okay. You see? And that's what Islam does. Islam tells people that if the voice of God told Muhammad to go kill people who disagreed with Muhammad, then that's okay because God ordained it. Whereas in the Jewish tradition, even if you think God is telling you to do something that is obviously wrong, right, then you have the responsibility of using your own consciousness to resist any authority, even God's, and you must always love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Rabbi Hillel the Elder, the most influential rabbi in all of history, because his teachings are the basis of Jewish jurisprudence. Hillel the Elder said, "Love your neighbor as yourself" is the core principle that produces all of Jewish law and ethics and politics, etc. He says everything else is commentary. So when in doubt, go back to Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself, because this is the core principle. This is your ground zero if you want to know what's right and what's wrong.
Amazing. So I'm going to pose this question, and then we're going to do a quick sponsor thank you.
Sure.
So is there a way out of this madness? And before you answer that, I want you to contemplate that for a second while I give a shout out to our sponsors. So Florida Balance Centers is where we are right now. It's such a beautiful space, and it's my sanctuary. It's Tom's sanctuary, and it's a sanctuary for so many of our patients that come and get help for vertigo, balance, dizziness, and acupuncture, emotional and nutritional support, and really optimizing your health and wellness. So we urge you to stop suffering. You don't have to suffer with those pains and that vertigo and whatever else you got going on. Call us, check us out on balancecenters.com. And for more information about EIEQ.com, visit our site, all about how to optimize your emotional health and take your crazy from bad crazy to good crazy. So thank you so much to our sponsors. And so let's get back to this really quick here. So
what's the way out?
So what's the way out? Yeah, like what's the way out of this madness? Is there a way out of this madness?
Well, we've been getting out of this madness for 25 centuries. So we started out in the West with the worst societies on the planet. So the Greco-Roman societies of antiquity were absolutely awful. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, didn't invent democracy, as they tell us in school. That's a lie. Because it's a lie that relies on the similarity between the two words. The modern English word democracy, it has an orthography that is obviously derived from the ancient Greek word demokratia. This is true. But the meanings are not the same. So the orthography is, there's a link, there's an orthographic link, but the meanings are completely different. In modern democracy, we think of a modern democracy as a state where all of the people inside the territory of the state are citizens equal under the law, and they all have access to the political system and the courts. They all vote. They're all equal under the law. In the supposedly most radical ancient Greek democracy, which was Athens, they had a system that was completely opposite to that. So Demetrius of Phalerum, who governed the Athenian Empire, I think in the year 310 before Jesus, he commissioned a census of the Athenian Empire, and the census found that there were 20,000 citizens, 10,000 medics. The medics were either semi-free or semi-slaves, depending on the political bias of the person describing the system. And then there were 400,000 slaves. That's not a democracy. Mm-hmm. And the slaves were brutalized daily in the most cruel manner. The ones who were treated the worst were the slaves in the mines of Laurium in the south, to the south of Athens. These were silver mines that produced an enormous amount of wealth for Athens. And in those mines, they had tens of thousands of slaves being worked to death. So they had death camps in ancient Athens. And they had other kinds of slaves that were perhaps not being worked to death, but they were still treated with enormous cruelty. So, for example, the slaves that worked as servants in the homes of citizens, of the tiny citizen ruling elite, those were raped daily, both men and women, at will. They could also be beaten at will by their masters. When there was a court case, either between a citizen in the state or between two citizens or whatever, they always had the slaves come give testimony, because the slaves, well, they were hearing everything. They were living inside the household, so they knew all of the gossip. They could see everything that was going on. So the slaves would have to testify, and it was normative to torture the slaves, because they believed that if the slaves gave testimony under torture, then they would tell the truth. So it was perfectly normal, in fact normative. It was obligatory to torture the slaves. And so on. We could go on. I mean, even the wives of the citizens were slaves, because they were prisoners in their homes. They couldn't leave their homes unless they were accompanied by their husband or by a trusted servant of their husband, and so forth. I could go on and on. The Romans were just awful. They inherited Greek culture, and they turned it up a notch. So, for example, for them, entertainment was going to the Roman circus and watching, the Colosseum and these other amphitheaters that they had, and watching how an African beast ate a human being right in front of them. So that they would burst in blood right in front of them, and they would applaud and cheer. This was like the movies to them. Mm-hmm. These were psychopathic power elites that were oppressing everybody around them and under them. And So these were the worst societies why do I say they were the worst societies in the world? They were the worst societies in the world because if you look at, for example, China in the same period of time, or even earlier, and you read, for example, Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist, you'll see that Sun Tzu, his work is still read today. It's a masterpiece of strategy. But you can also see in Sun Tzu not only brilliant ideas about how to win a war, but also implicit and sometimes explicit, are the principles, the moral principles that the Chinese had at the time, because Sun Tzu says that the best general is the one who wins a war without having to fight it. He says that the second best general is the one who fights a war and wins it, killing the fewest people possible, right? So obviously, to Sun Tzu, life is valuable and one must preserve it, both the lives of your own soldiers and those of the enemy soldiers, right? This is all in Sun Tzu. Whereas in Rome, the biggest what's the word? The biggest honor that you could receive from the Roman state was called the triumph. That's where the word comes from. And the triumph, if you were a general who's having a triumph bestowed upon him, then exceptionally, because soldiers could not walk into the city of Rome armed, right? There was something called the pomerium, which was the sacred boundary of Rome. And so once you crossed that, you weren't allowed to have your weapons with you. You had to leave them outside of the city. This was to prevent civil wars and so forth. But exceptionally, when a general was getting a triumph, he could parade with his soldiers in full, with their full armor and weapons around the city, and the general himself would ride a chariot, and people would throw flowers and confetti at him and whatever, and he would dress as Jupiter, with a purple robe as Jupiter, and the experience was so tremendous that there was one guy designated to sit in the chariot with him, right behind him, whispering in his ear the whole time, "You are not a god, you are not a god, you are not a god," because the experience might confuse the general, you see. Well, this honor, which was the biggest honor that the Roman state gave to any of its citizens, the triumph, the way to win the triumph was to kill at least 5,000 enemy soldiers in one battle. So what they were celebrating in the triumph was butchery. That's what they were celebrating. These were psychopathic power elites, okay? The worst societies on earth. Well, those societies, 25 centuries later, became the best societies on earth. So we've been doing this. We've been doing this in the West. We've been getting better and better and better over the course of 25 centuries, thanks to Jewish influence. So how do we keep ourselves on course is the question. And in my view, the way we keep ourselves on course is by fighting anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism is the ideology that the power elites who want to oppress us use in order to recruit us to our own process of enslavement. We saw this in World War II. So not only in World War II, but World War II is recent. People know about it, so I often talk about it. In World War II, the anti-Semites, the people who wanted to enslave us, launched a world war. They plunged the entire planet into war, right? Yes, they killed the Jewish people. They killed between 6 and 5 million Jews, but they also managed to get more than 64 million non-Jews killed as well. 64 million. And in addition, hundreds of millions of non-Jews were enslaved, right? So anti-Semitism is the shall we say, the strategic tool of the repressive power elites to re-enslave us. And the reason they use anti-Semitism, the reason they use hatred of Jews, is that precisely it is the influence of the Jewish people in Jewish thought, Jewish law, Jewish political organization, etc., that has been inspiring us over 25 centuries to free ourselves from oppression. Think about the European Enlightenment. Okay, the European Enlightenment is the ethical and political movement that transformed thinking in the West and moved the evolution of Western thought and political institutions in the direction of freedom and democracy. Okay, that's what the Enlightenment did. Well, the Enlightenment is a Jewish achievement. The Enlightenment was lit by Baruch Spinoza, one of the most important philosophers of all time. And Spinoza was learning his way of thinking from the Talmud. He grew up studying the Talmud. And everybody understood at the time that Spinoza was developing the thought of Moses Maimonides, perhaps the most important thinker of all time. Because Maimonides is the guy who got the Western intellectuals, who were all priests, Catholic priests at the time, he got them thinking in terms of Aristotelian rationalism in science, all right? And he made Jewish law interesting to them again because he made a rationalist defense of Jewish law. And his most important student, though he was a posthumous student, was Thomas Aquinas, who was a very important Catholic priest who became the biggest influence on Catholic thought since Augustine. So Thomas Aquinas was getting all of this from Moses Maimonides. He gives him credit in his masterpiece. And through Aquinas, Maimonides transformed Western thinking, moved them in the direction of rationalism and science, etc. And that eventually produced the Renaissance. And then the guy who lights the torch from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, that's another Jewish thinker, which is Baruch Spinoza. And he was re-injecting Maimonist thought, the thought of Moses Maimonides, into the thinking of Christian intellectuals. And that eventually produced the revolutions that brought us the modern world. So I think the people who want to re-enslave us understand this history very well. This is why they mobilize propaganda so that people will learn to hate the Jews. And because they understand that if people learn to hate the Jews, they will be shooting themselves in the foot. They will be attacking the movement that has been liberating them for 25 centuries. So this is the way to re-enslave Westerners. It's to teach them to hate the Jews and to support movements that attack the Jews. So how do we keep it's a long answer, but how do we keep ourselves on the path to liberate ourselves and construct societies where we can live in peace and brotherhood? I think the first job that we have to do is to fight anti-Semitism and teach the true history of Jewish influence in the Western world.
Well, that's easy. So, my God, there's so much we could do with this, so much more we can have with these conversations, and we might have to do a part 2, but so where do you see emotional intelligence playing in that?
Emotional intelligence. Okay, so I understand emotional intelligence to be the ability to kind of step back from your own emotions and observe them so that you can make behavioral decisions based on your reflections about your emotions and your own needs, your unfulfilled needs that are causing those emotions and so forth, instead of reacting automatically to whatever you're feeling at the moment, like a robot, and lashing out or becoming grief-stricken or whatever. I think emotional intelligence is very important. My approach to it has been through nonviolent communication, taught by Marshall Rosenberg.
Great book.
Oh yeah,
yes.
I'm a big student of Marshall Rosenberg.
Yes.
I have actually taught nonviolent communication, and I'm a big believer in the principles of NVC, because what he teaches is that, well, first of all, he teaches that if you're an adult, you have to be responsible for your behavior. The fact that you have an emotion doesn't justify just doing whatever the momentary emotion seems to be demanding. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that he teaches is that you can't make other people responsible for your emotion. right? So he says, look, the same stimulus can produce different kinds of emotions in different people. We see this now with the woke snowflakes who get offended about everything. Well, just 15 years ago, people were not getting offended by those things. So obviously the same stimulus can cause different kinds of emotional responses depending on who you are and what your background is and what you learned and so forth. So he teaches that it's very important not to make others responsible for what you're feeling. What you're feeling is not simply a consequence of the stimulus, it's a consequence of the interpretation you're giving to the stimulus. So he says, if you're feeling an emotion, what you need to do is, first of all, take responsibility for the emotion you're feeling, pause before you react, and give yourself some compassion, right? You know, you're feeling this way, you know, give yourself a little hug and try to understand what's the unfulfilled need that is causing you to feel that emotion. What is it that you're not getting from the world? And then you can communicate that need to whoever's responsible for the stimulus that caused you to feel the emotion, right? And you can say something like, look, so for example, the example I always use is, because it happens in every couple, Rosenberg used to say that it's always the case that neat freaks marry slobs, you know? For some reason, it's a kind of a law of the universe that whoever your spouse is, one of them is going to be way neater than the other, right? So if you're the neat freak, you walk into the kitchen and you see the kitchen is a mess, right? The wrong thing to do, according to Rosenberg, would be to say, "Oh my God, look what you did! You left the kitchen a mess. Now this is terrible." No, what you have to do is simply turn to your spouse and you say, "Look, I have a strong need for order, you know, and when I see the kitchen this way, it really stresses me out. It's very frustrating for me. So let's try to cooperate to make sure that the kitchen is a little cleaner, because that's going to make me feel better." Well, if you talk like that to your spouse, the spouse, first of all, was not attacked, right? The spouse was not called a bad person. The spouse was not made responsible for the emotion that you're feeling, right? And so there's nothing to defend yourself from. There's no reason that there should be a fight because you haven't been attacked, right? On the contrary, what you did was you explained what it is that you need to feel better without blaming anyone. And that makes it easier for the spouse to see the suffering, right? And the probability that the spouse will want to cooperate to make you feel better rises considerably, right? So your chances of getting what you need are much better when you do things this way than when you scream and blame and accuse people. So I think emotional intelligence, particularly the way Marshall Rosenberg teaches it, is an excellent way of getting people to get along better and live in peace.
Yeah. And would you say that do you think that the evildoers could actually implement that at all? Is that just wishful thinking?
Well, I mean, so the problem is that evildoers, as I understand it, are acting within a meaning framework that makes their evil doing meaningful. So the first thing we have to do, I think, as Westerners who want to live in peace and democracy and freedom and so forth, the first thing we have to do is defend ourselves from people who want to do us harm. So there's nothing wrong with self-defense. And no republic can survive if it simply allows monsters to attack it. So unfortunately, some violence is necessary to defend a space where people can be free and live in peace. You can't do without borders, and you can't do without forces to defend people from monsters. So the first thing we have to do is ensure that there is a geographical space where peace and freedom and democracy can be attempted. Right? You need that protected space. That's job number one. And of course, if we can preserve that space, then we can turn that space into a refuge for all of those who want to escape monstrous societies and monstrous social systems and religions that are doing harm to other human beings. right? So this is Ayaan Hirsi Ali's argument. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a refugee from the Muslim world. She grew up in Somalia, and she had a marriage already arranged for her and everything, and she escaped to Holland, and she's become a very important defender of Western liberty and Western civilization, because what she says is, what I found in the West was a place where I could be myself without oppression, without other people telling me who I was supposed to be and who I was supposed to serve and so forth. And I think that's the relationship that the West should have to oppressive societies, just like we did when we were in the Cold War, right? We were the refuge for people who wanted to escape communist slavery. We were not inviting communist commissars to organize communist cells and indoctrinate our people into communist slavery. We were not. That was not the official policy. The official policy was, we are enemies of communist states, and those communist slaves who want to escape and take refuge in the West, we will take them. We will protect them. Right? I think that's the relationship we should have with Islamic societies. But we've been doing the opposite. We've been allowing the most radical states like Qatar and Turkey and Kuwait and so forth, and even Iran, to finance the mosques that are going up all over the West. And of course, the clerics in those mosques are preaching jihad. They're preaching the destruction of Western institutions. They're preaching holy war against infidels, which means us. This policy is designed to destroy the West. So that has to change really fast. That's the first thing we have to do, defend ourselves. And then the next thing we have to do, once we have ensured that we have secure borders where we can continue to develop democracy, we have to export it. We have to make sure that we are helping others become free as well. Because the only way to be safe for the long term is to make the whole world democratic. Did you know that one of the most, or perhaps the most interesting fact in all of political science is that two democracies have not yet gone to war?
Which ones?
No, it hasn't happened yet.
Oh.
This is remarkable. So when people live in democracy, it appears that democratic peoples always think that whatever their disputes with some other democratic state, this can all be negotiated. There's no reason to go to war. So democracies have fought wars, but they always fight wars against non-democratic states. Two democratic states have not yet gone to war. So now we know what we have to do to live in peace. We just have to make the whole world democratic.
Right.
And war will be a thing of the past.
And I think that's the thing, though. We have the evildoers that just don't want that. That's the problem. And that's how do you stop evil, right? So one of the questions here is, how do you stop evil? And that's probably going to be a whole other video, because that's like an endless conversation.
Well, I mean, so the short answer, how do you stop evil, is you need to fight for freedom of expression, because when all ideas are allowed into the public sphere, the superiority of the ideas that the Jewish people and the movements of Semitism more generally have been pushing for the last 4,300 years, those are obviously the superior ideas. And if we can have a world in which everybody can speak, it'll just be obvious. We will convince everyone not to kill each other and not to rape each other and not to oppress each other. It'll happen.
So you believe it's possible?
Of course.
If there was freedom of speech and there was open forum to discuss all ideas, that the light would prevail.
Yes, I think so. This is what happened in the Enlightenment. It's what's been happening for 25 centuries, and it's happening again thanks to the podcast revolution. And what you're doing and what other podcasters are doing, which allows Western citizens to communicate with each other without the big media becoming an interference, right? I think this is the path forward. Of course, there's a danger that the power elites will succeed in putting all kinds of obstacles and censoring the internet. We've seen it, for example, if you look at the investigation on the Twitter files, which became possible thanks to the fact that Elon Musk bought Twitter, now X. You'll see that the intelligence agencies of the United States were working very hard to destroy freedom of speech in the internet. So we have to fight back and make sure that we preserve the internet as a free space for Western citizens to communicate with each other, because now we have the technologies to do it. And I think it's very important to do what you're doing and what many other people are doing, to have these conversations and for people to be able to listen and to share such content and have the conversations that we need to have with each other, and stop yelling each other down and canceling each other and censoring each other, regardless of our views. It doesn't matter if you're pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, pro-Trump, pro-Biden. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you respect the other guy's right to speak. And it matters that when the other guy speaks, you listen. And even if you disagree, what you should do is, forgive me, forgot to turn this off. What you should do is try to.
What time is it, by the way?
It's almost time to stop.
Okay.
But what you should do is try to produce reasonable arguments against what the other person is saying. And do your best to gather the best evidence and the best arguments, and simply be respectful of others. If we do that, then the best ideas will win. And if you think you have the best ideas, then you don't need to shout anybody down. Mm-hmm. If you think you have the best ideas, then go ahead and defend them in the open court of free expression.
Mm-hmm. So I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I just want you to give me a quick, just a synopsis of what you saw in Israel, because I know you just were in Israel. Just give us a quick, I guess, a theme that you saw, a pattern, and something that we can leave.
Well, I'll tell you something that was very dramatic in Israel, because I made a trip to Israel just a few weeks ago during this Hamas-Israel war, and I saw a very big contrast in the relationship between the Israeli civilian and the Israeli soldier versus the relationship between the Hamas soldier and the Arab Palestinian Gaza civilian. I'll give you two anecdotes. So I traveled to the south to see the kibbutzim that were destroyed on October 7th. And then they took us to see one of these centers where the organized Israeli civilians are pampering the Israeli soldiers. Okay, so soldiers get a day off from fighting at the front, and so they have these stations where organized Israeli civilians, this is not a government thing, this is done by civil society. They organize these camps where soldiers come and they get food, they get a sandwich, they get juice, they get massages. There's all kinds of nice things that grateful Israeli civilians do for their soldiers, because they're defending their country, they're defending their lives. Right. And there's a beautiful, very solidary, loving relationship between the Israeli soldier and the Israeli civilian. And it was very moving to watch. And I had the opportunity to speak with many young soldiers at this place, and many girls, 19-year-old girls who enlisted and were fighting for their country. And the mood was very upbeat. These were happy kids who were very proud to be fighting for their country, to be serving in the army. And then I was taken to Shomron to visit the communities that are in a bit of a panic right now, because they're without men, because the men are fighting at the front, and they're worried that the Arab Palestinian terrorists in Judea and Samaria might attack them too. So there some volunteers have been coming from the other side of the Green Line to assist these communities and protect them. But when I was there, I visited a friend who lives there, and I had the opportunity to speak with her 3 children because all 3 of her sons are fighting at the front. But on this particular day, by coincidence, they were on leave visiting their mom and dad, and so I had opportunity to talk to them, and they gave me some anecdotes. I'll tell you one. This kid, this soldier, told me that he happens to be a very good soldier, and he's been praised and is probably going to be rewarded with some medal because he saved several of his fellow soldiers who are not as clever and as have as good judgment as his. And in one of these instances, he tells me that there was this low barrier behind which was this Arab Palestinian kid, and he was crying out for water. Okay, so he was saying mime, which means water in Hebrew, and this was an area that was already being patrolled by Israeli soldiers, and one of the soldiers approached to give the kid a bottle of water, right? Because Israeli soldiers are not interested in oppressing Arab civilians. They're fighting for their country, but they're not. Contrary to what you hear in the media, which only repeats the lies that the Hamas terrorists put out, the Israeli soldiers are not there to hurt Arab civilians. So of course, this soldier went over to the Arab kid to give him a bottle of water, and then my friend's son realized what this guy was doing. He says, "Don't be an idiot. Throw him the bottle. Don't walk up to him." But this was too late, or rather, the minute he made that warning, the friend reacted. There was only a few steps left, so from there he threw the bottle, and the second he did that, the kid blew up into pieces, and he ended up with the kid all over his shirt and pants, because what was going on is that below that hidden behind that low barrier was a terrorist who was using the kid to make the soldier approach so he could kill the soldier, and he thought he was going to lose his chance, so he blew up the kid. That's the relationship between the Arab civilian and the Hamas soldier. Mm-hmm. The Hamas soldier thinks of the Arab civilian as bait to kill Israeli soldiers. Mm-hmm. So the Israeli soldier was trying to give this kid water, whereas the Hamas soldier was using this kid as a human bomb to kill an Israeli soldier. That's a very different relationship. And what people need to understand is that what Israel is fighting to preserve is this world of peace, of solidarity between human beings, whereas Hamas is possessed by this ideology that we've also been discussing here, where they derive meaning from killing people they disagree with. Mm-hmm. And to them, killing people they disagree with is so important that they will even kill their own people if that is useful to kill infidels. Mm-hmm. This movement needs to be defeated. If we do not defeat this movement, it will destroy us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So with that, what is a final message that you have for the world? I mean, if you could impart one message for all of us, what would it be to help us overcome this, to find that light at the end of the tunnel,
Well, the message would be, don't forget that love your neighbor as you love yourself is something we learned from the Jews. And the pattern that I've been alluding to several times in this conversation is precisely the pattern where whenever anti-Semitism grows, especially when it reaches epidemic proportions, everybody's in danger. Don't forget that. When anti-Semitism grew to a fever pitch in the 20th century, what we got was World War II. And World War II was murdering everybody, not just the Jews. And it was enslaving everybody, right? So don't forget, when anti-Semitism reaches fever pitch, everybody's in danger, not just the Jews. The fight against anti-Semitism is not charity to the Jews. It's Western self-defense. That's the message I would send to everybody.
Well, there you have it, guys. There you have it. So thank you so much again, Francisco.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. And we will continue, to fight and do what we have to do to stand for what's right and try to manage that crazy, right? And move ourselves into a better state of mind where everyone... Yes,
share the material.
Exactly, where everyone benefits. So guys, remember, share, like, subscribe, and thank you again for joining us on this very most important conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Esther.
All right, guys, take care.